3 years. That was how long Kaya had been measuring her life in moons rather than seasons, in the distance between one grave and the next breath she allowed herself to take. 3 years, since the night the midwife had pressed a bundle of silence into her arms, and the silence had stayed. 3 years since she had buried her daughter beneath the cedar at the eastern edge of the Ashvale territory, a place no one visited, a tree no one pruned, a mound no one tended except her. 3 years of walking out alone, on the night of every full moon, to press her palm flat against the cold soil and say the name she had given a child who never opened her eyes. She was there now. The moon hung low and enormous above the Ashvale ridge, casting everything in the color of old silver. Kaya's knees were wet through her leggings, where she knelt in the frost-stiffened grass. Her bare hand, the one she had pulled from her glove and pressed flat to the earth, had stopped feeling the cold somewhere past the first quarter hour. She did not move it. The numbness was its own kind of marker, a way of measuring how long she had stayed, of proving she had stayed long enough, that she had not hurried this the way she hurried everything else now. She did not weep. She had learned, somewhere in the first year, that weeping accomplished nothing the moon could not witness without her assistance. Instead, she spoke in a low and even voice, almost conversational, the way she might have spoken to a living child sitting beside her rather than beneath her. 36 moons, she said. That is how many times I have come. The wind moved through the cedar above her. Nothing answered. She had stopped expecting an answer, somewhere around month 7. She pressed her hand deeper into the soil, fingers spreading as far as they would go. The ground gave slightly under the pressure, not soft, not quite frozen, the peculiar mid-state of autumn earth at altitude, and she noted this with the part of her mind that still functioned like a healer, still catalogued sensation rather than drowning in it. She had been a healer once. She still was, technically, though the pack she served had reduced her function to the most mechanical of its applications. Setting bones the warriors broke in training, stitching wounds from border skirmishes, delivering the pups of women whose pregnancies were too ordinary to warrant the attention of the pack's senior healers. She did not think about those deliveries while she knelt here. She had rules about that. I am still here, she said to the ground, still in the same position, still in the same pack house, same room, same window. Nothing has changed. A pause. That is probably good, that you are not here to watch nothing change. She was quiet for a long time after that. It was on the walk back, the long downhill path from the eastern ridge through the pine corridor that emptied into the rear courtyard of the Ashvale pack house, that she felt it for the first time, though she would not understand what it was until much later. A pull, not painful, not even particular, simply a sensation somewhere beneath her sternum, as though something that had been wound very tight had released a single degree of tension, the way a door feels just before it opens, though no hand has yet touched the handle. She stopped walking. She stood in the pine corridor in the dark, in the cold, in the absolute stillness that settles over high-altitude pack territory in the deep of autumn, and she placed her hand over the center of her chest and pressed. The sensation was already gone. Whatever it had been, it left no trace she could examine. Kaya removed her hand. She continued down the path. She noted the sensation in the part of her mind that kept clinical records, filed it under things that require no immediate explanation, and did not think about it again. She would, later. She would think about it constantly. But that was later, and tonight she had rounds to finish, a bone broth to check on the healer house fire, and 36 moons of habit telling her that the walk home was simply the walk home, and that nothing waited at the end of it, but the quiet continuation of a life she had long since made her peace with. She was wrong, and she was right, and the distance between those two things was exactly the distance she would have to travel before she understood which parts of her life had already ended and which parts were about to begin. She pulled her glove back on. She walked down through the pines. The moon followed her the whole way, enormous and silver and entirely without mercy. 3 years ago, everything had been different, and almost nothing had been good, but it had at least been legible. She had known the shape of her life then. She had known, or thought she knew, exactly what she was worth, and to whom, and under what conditions. She had been wrong about that too, but that was a different kind of wrong, and it belonged to a different part of the story. Kaya was 26 years old, an Omega of the Ashvale Pack, which occupied the northeastern mountain corridor of the territories that answered, at least in principle, to the authority of the Crown. The Ashvale Pack was mid-sized, neither wealthy nor destitute, governed by an alpha named Rennick, who had inherited his position from his father and administered it with the cheerless efficiency of a man who had never wanted the role but had not found a graceful way to refuse it. He was not cruel, he was not kind, he was present in the way that weather is present, consistent, impersonal, and unlikely to change its behavior based on your preferences. Kaya had grown up in this pack. Her mother had been a healer here, her grandmother before her. The healer line of the Ashvale Pack ran through the women on Kaya's maternal side, the way certain bloodlines ran hunting instinct, or night vision, quietly, usefully, without particular ceremony. No one in the pack would have said that Kaya was unvalued. They would have said she was reliable, and meant it as a compliment, and not noticed the gap between those two things. She had been bonded at 23, briefly, to a mid-rank warrior named Davin, who had chosen her with the pragmatic calculus of a man who wanted a capable partner rather than a passionate one. She had accepted him with a similar calculus. This was not a love story, and neither of them had pretended it was. There was warmth occasionally. There was competence, consistently. There was a shared bed, and a shared table, and a shared set of quiet expectations, and for approximately 7 months it had constituted something close to a functional life. Then she had become pregnant, and everything had reorganized itself around that fact, and for a while she had felt something she did not have precise language for. Not happiness, exactly, but a kind of purposeful heat, as though the cold competence she had been operating at for most of her adult life had a reason now, a direction, something it was building toward. The pregnancy had been difficult. She had known that from the beginning, had read it in her own body, with the clinical fluency of her training, the way the pup's scent never quite resolved into the clear, bright signature of a healthy bond, remaining instead at the edge of detection, thin and intermittent, like a candle in wind. She had not told Davin. She had told herself, with the determined rationality she brought to all things, that the reading could be wrong, that her own anxiety was distorting her assessment, that healers made poor patients precisely because they could not stop diagnosing themselves. She had been right that healers made poor patients. She had been wrong about the rest. The pup had been born on a night in late autumn, 37 moons ago, during a storm that made the pack house walls creak and the torch flames lean sideways. She had been silent. She had been small. She had had dark hair, very fine, and her face in repose had looked. Kaya had noted this with the healer part of her mind that never entirely shut off, entirely peaceful. The midwife had said what midwives say in such moments. Davin had said less. He had stood in the doorway of the birthing room for some time, looking at the bundle Kaya held, and then he had said he needed air, and he had stepped outside, and the distance between them that had always been functional had become, in that moment, measurable in some other unit. He had left the pack 6 weeks later. Not dramatically, simply left, transferred his alliance to a southern pack through a cousin connection, sent a formal dissolution notice through the pack alpha's office, and that was the end of it. Kaya had signed the dissolution papers with her left hand because her right was busy cataloging medications. She had not felt very much at the time. The feeling arrived later, in small, undramatic increments, on various unremarkable Tuesdays, when she would be measuring out a poultice or banking a fire, and would suddenly understand, with great specificity, exactly how comprehensively alone she was. She had buried her daughter beneath the cedar. She had gone back to work. She had kept the grave tended, and the healer house stocked, and the rounds completed on schedule, and she had done all of this without mentioning any of it to anyone, because there was no one to whom she owed that information, and because the effort of explaining it would cost more than the relief of sharing it would provide. This was the life Kaya had made. It was not a large life, but it was hers, precisely and entirely, which meant it was the one thing in the current arrangement she could not imagine losing. The autumn she turned 26 was the autumn the king sent word he was coming. The message arrived through official channels 17 days before his expected date of arrival. A formal notice from the Crown's administrative office, sealed with the silver and black mark of the Alpha King's house, addressed to Alpha Rennick of Ashvale, informing him that King Soren of the Northern Throne would be conducting a territorial review of the northeastern mountain packs and would require lodging and hospitality for a period of 3 days. The pack responded to this news the way packs always responded to royal attention, with enormous collective anxiety expressed through the medium of frantic cleaning. The common areas were scrubbed, the guest quarters were refurnished, the kitchen staff tripled their usual output. 3 different wolves in mid-management positions had loud, poorly concealed disagreements about protocol that Kaya observed with the detached interest of someone who had correctly identified that none of this would affect her in any meaningful way. She had, of course, encountered the king's name before. Everyone in the Northern Territories had. Soren of the Northern Throne had held the crown for 11 years, ascending at 20 after his father's sudden death, and he had governed in the years since with a precision and a controlled severity that even his detractors did not mistake for weakness. He was not beloved the way some kings were, warmly, personally, with the kind of popular affection that made people name their children after you. He was respected. In some contexts he was feared. These are not always different things, but in his case, the distinction seemed meaningful to the people who had been in the room with him, which Kaya had not. She had no reason to expect she would be. The Ashvale Healer House was located at the northwest corner of the pack compound, separated from the main residential buildings by a short covered walkway and a small medicinal garden that Kaya kept producing, well past the season, when anyone else would have let it go. She spent most of her waking hours there. The king's review would take place in the main hall, the training grounds, the administrative buildings, and the Alpha's residence. Their paths, by any reasonable geography, would not cross. She told herself this, and believed it, and began preparing a fresh dispensary inventory in anticipation of the increased foot traffic a royal visit would bring, because increased foot traffic always brought increased minor injuries, and she liked to be prepared. She was grinding dried valerian root on the morning the king arrived, 19 days after the message, and 2 days ahead of schedule, which was the first indication that he was not the kind of man who moved on anyone else's timeline. She heard the change in the compound's ambient sound, the shift from its normal frequency to something slightly more compressed, slightly more attended, the particular quality of sound that a space makes when something important has entered it, and she noted it and continued grinding. She did not go to look. There was no reason to go and look. She ground the valerian until it was fine enough, set it aside, and moved on to the feverfew. The external threat did not announce itself the way threats in stories do. There was no warning, no formal declaration, no single dramatic moment that Kaya could identify, after the fact, as the one where everything changed. Instead, it arrived incrementally, in the way that serious dangers often do, through a series of small, individually manageable problems that accumulated faster than they could be addressed. It began with the sickness. The first case appeared in the pack's eastern residential quarter, 6 days before the king's planned arrival, 2 days after his actual arrival, a coincidence of timing that Kaya noted without particular significance. A child, 7 years old, presenting with fever and the specific quality of respiratory distress that she associated, from her training and her grandmother's journals, with a strain she had no modern name for, but had seen described in records from 2 generations back. A pack fever, not fatal as a rule, not in healthy adults, but fast-moving and particular in its progression, and capable, in the very old or the very young, of settling into the lungs in ways that required careful, sustained management. She treated the child, isolated the eastern quarter, and sent a formal notification to Alpha Rennick's office. By the following morning, there were 4 cases. By the morning after that, 11. By the morning the King's review was scheduled to begin in the main hall, Kaya had not slept in 31 hours, had moved a makeshift treatment ward into the larger of the 2 healer house rooms, and was operating with the particular crystalline focus of exhaustion, so complete it had gone past feeling like exhaustion, and arrived somewhere closer to a very bright, very narrow light. She did not attend the formal review. No one noticed she was missing. What she noticed, what she registered with the part of her mind that was still logging information, even when the rest of her was on its 5th consecutive hour of managing fevers and keeping airways clear and reassuring frightened parents in a voice she kept carefully level, was that the pack's senior leadership was thoroughly occupied with the optics of the royal visit, which meant that the management of the outbreak had fallen, by default, entirely to her. She did not resent this. Resentment required energy she could not spare. She organized it instead, broke it into components, what was needed, in what order, by which means, the feverfew and valerian she had prepared, the steam treatments she had been doing by hand, 1 patient at a time, crouching over each fever-bright face with a cloth and a basin, the hydration protocols, the careful rotation of the worst cases to the coolest position in the room, nearest the fresh air that came under the east-facing door when she propped it with a stone. 14 patients at the outbreak's peak, 12 adults, 2 children. The youngest was 3 years old, dark-eyed, and fought the fever with the exhausting, wordless persistence of very small children who do not yet understand that they are supposed to be frightened. Kaya worked around her steadily, checking her temperature by touch, the wrist, the throat, the soft skin behind the ear, with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who had done this so many times. The motion had become a kind of grammar, a language her hands spoke, without requiring translation from her mind. On the 3rd night, the child's fever spiked. Kaya was already there. She had not left. She worked through the spike without sleep, without assistance, without anyone in the main hall knowing the eastern quarter was managing a crisis at all. By dawn, the fever had broken. The child slept normally. Kaya sat on the floor beside the cot, her back against the wall, her eyes open, her hands folded in her lap, and breathed for approximately 3 minutes before she got up and checked on the next patient. She was on her feet, walking the room, basin in hand, when the door opened. Not a patient, not a parent, not anyone she expected. She did not look up immediately. She was mid-task, lowering the basin to the nearest surface with the care of someone acutely aware of the weight of water, and so she had a full 3 seconds of the man's presence in the room before she registered who he was, which meant that her first impression was not of the crown or the controlled authority or any of the things she had heard described. It was of a stillness, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has walked into a difficult situation and is in the process of understanding exactly how difficult it is. She looked up. He was taller than she had imagined, though she could not have said what she had imagined. dark clothing, no ornamentation, which surprised her. She had expected a king on a review to present with some evidence of his position. He had gray eyes, the specific gray of overcast sky at altitude, and they were moving across the room in a way that was not casual, not performative, but genuinely assessing, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand, rather than simply to see. He had not looked at her yet. She straightened, she said, in the level, informational voice she used with all visitors. The Eastern Residential Quarter is under a fever isolation protocol. If you are not here for treatment, you should not be in this space. He turned, then he looked at her. The stillness changed. It did not disappear. It was evidently too fundamental a part of him to simply vanish. But something within it shifted, the way a room's quality of light shifts when a door is opened. She noted this, and did not know what to do with the notation. "How long has this been running?" he asked. His voice was even. It carried. 9 days, she said. 14 cases at peak. We are currently at 11. The 2 children are stable. He was quiet for a moment. Who authorized the isolation protocol? I did. You are the pack healer. I am the junior pack healer. The senior healer is attending the review in the main hall. She did not say this with any particular tone. It was simply accurate. He looked at her for a moment longer than felt entirely functional. She returned the look with the expression she wore for all clinical assessments. Present, neutral, gathering information. "What do you need?" he said. It was not phrased as an offer. It was phrased as a request for a list. She told him. She listed everything she was short on, the specific herbs, the additional basins, a second pair of hands for the overnight watch, clean linens, and she did it in the same inventory voice she used for everything, without hedging and without apology, because she had learned a long time ago that hedging took more energy than confidence and accomplished less. He listened to the entire list without interrupting, then he turned and left. She watched him go, and then returned to her basin. She noted that her hands were completely steady. She did not examine why she had expected them not to be. Everything she had listed arrived within 90 minutes. 2 of his household staff came with the supplies and were dispatched, at her direction, to specific tasks in specific quadrants of the room, without any apparent resentment, which suggested they had been given clear instructions about cooperation. She worked alongside them without ceremony. By evening, the ward was running with a different quality of efficiency than it had managed under her sole direction. Not better, exactly, but lighter, the kind of lightness that comes when the weight of a task is distributed to its logical number of hands. Soren came back. He came back that evening, and the evening after that, arriving without announcement, staying for the duration of an hour's work, asking questions in that same flat, information-gathering register, and receiving her answers with the same attentive listening. He did not tell her she was doing well. He did not express admiration, or surprise, or any of the things that men who were impressed by women they had underestimated typically expressed. He simply worked, or rather, he facilitated her work, which was more useful. On the 5th day of his stay, 2 days past his scheduled departure, she found him standing outside the healer house in the early morning, before she had opened the door, looking out at the medicinal garden, with an expression she could not entirely read. He had a cup of something. He had brought a second one, which he held out to her when she came through the door. She took it, because refusing would have required more energy than accepting, and she was saving her energy for things that mattered. "You bury someone here," he said. She went still. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that carries such specific certainty that asking for confirmation would be redundant. "On the eastern ridge," she said, after a moment, "under a cedar. I smelled your grief the first night." He said it without looking at her. "It has a particular signature. I thought it was from the outbreak." It took me until the second day to understand it was older than that, much older. She held the cup in both hands and did not say anything. 3 years, he said. It was still not a question. 36 moons, she said. 37, now. He turned then and looked at her, and she understood, in the way she understood clinical facts, precisely and without drama, that whatever had shifted in the room's light the first morning he had walked through that door had not shifted back, and was not going to. He said, quietly, "Tell me her name." And Kaya, who had not spoken her daughter's name aloud to another living person in 3 years, said it. She said it in the same level, informational voice she used for everything, because it was the only voice she had, and because the level voice was not the absence of feeling, but its containment, its most functional form. Soren did not respond to the name with condolence. He received it the way he received information, with full attention, with the sense that it was being catalogued somewhere that mattered, somewhere it would not be misplaced or forgotten or reduced to its surface dimensions. He inclined his head slightly, in the way that a person does when they are acknowledging the significance of something that exceeds their language for it. She appreciated this more than she could have articulated. They stood together in the medicinal garden for a long time without speaking. The morning light moved across the frost-stiffened herbs in the systematic way of autumn light, working from east to west, brightening one thing at a time. She found she did not need to fill the silence. He did not seem to need that either. She had been alone with her grief for so long that she had forgotten it was possible to be in its presence with another person, without the grief becoming smaller for the company, or the person becoming implicated in its weight. He did neither. He simply stood in it with her, the way one stands in weather. It was the most significant act of companionship she had experienced in 3 years, and it had not required a single touch. It was Rennick's wife, Marta, who first said it aloud, or near enough to aloud, that it amounted to the same thing. She said it to 2 other women in the Pack Alpha's kitchen, 3 doors down from the covered walkway, in a voice calibrated for private conversation, but not for the acoustics of stone-walled corridor. Kaya was in the corridor. She heard it clearly. The king has not left. He was supposed to leave 4 days ago, and he has not left, and he has spent more time in that healer house in the past week than he has spent in Rennick's hall. Whatever is happening in there is not a fever protocol. The other voices were lower, less distinct. Kaya moved through the corridor without slowing. She thought about this as she prepared the morning's medication rounds. She was aware that the conversations Soren kept having with her had a quality she had not encountered in other conversations about work, which was that it did not stay entirely about work. He asked about the medicinal garden, specifically which plants she had introduced herself versus inherited from her mother, and she found herself explaining the logic of her choices in more detail than the questions strictly required. He asked about her grandmother's journals, which she had mentioned once in passing, and the following day she had found she wanted to bring one to show him, which was an impulse she noted with some clinical surprise. She did not bring it. She kept the conversation at the level of the practical. She did not know what to do with anything that exceeded the practical. But she noticed, for instance, that she had stopped waking up in the blue-gray pre-dawn with the specific quality of emptiness that had been her companion for 3 years, and had instead been waking up with something less definable, not happiness, not precisely, but a kind of attentiveness, as if the world had developed a feature worth being awake for. She noticed that her hands, which she had only registered for the past 3 years in terms of their function, what they could do, how steady they were, how long they could work, had begun to register in other terms, that she was aware of them in a way she had not been, that when Soren passed close to her in the narrow space of the healer house, adjusting the position of a supply basin or reaching for a clean cloth, she was aware of the proximity of his hands to hers in a way that was not clinical. This was new information. She did not know what to do with it. On the 6th day of his extended stay, she went to the eastern ridge. She went at noon rather than at full moon, which was unusual, a departure from the ritual she had maintained for 3 years. She was not sure what had moved the visit to this off-schedule hour. She went anyway, because the impulse seemed worth following, and because she had learned, in the years of surviving on her own functional discipline, to give weight to the impulses that broke the pattern. She had been at the grave for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard footsteps on the path behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had time, in the seconds before she did, to understand that the footsteps were not tentative, not approaching with the careful uncertainty of someone unsure of their welcome, but measured, unhurried, carrying the same quality of deliberate stillness that characterized all of Soren's movement. She turned. He stopped a respectful distance away. He looked at the cedar. He looked at the mound of earth, carefully tended, at the small, smooth stones she had arranged at its head, in no pattern she could have explained. He did not speak. She said, because it felt like the right information to give, "I come on the full moon, always, even in winter, even when the path ices." "I know," he said. "I felt it." She turned this over. Felt it. Every month, for 3 years. He was looking at the cedar. I did not know what it was. I felt a pull, a distance ache. I thought, the first year, that it was pack connectivity, some edge of territorial sensitivity I had not mapped. The second year, I understood it was a person. The third year, I understood the shape of it. The grief, the constancy, the way it sharpened on certain nights and then released. He paused. I did not understand the source until I came here and smelled your particular grief and recognized that I had been carrying it at a remove for 36 moons. Kaya was very still. "That is not possible," she said. "It was not a protest. It was a clinical observation." "I know what the bond protocols say," he said. "I also know what I have felt for 3 years." He turned to look at her directly. "And I know that the ache in my chest on the night of the full moon is the same ache I can feel right now, standing 6 feet from you, which is either a very remarkable coincidence, or it is not a coincidence at all." She held his gaze. The clinical part of her mind was working very hard at something and not getting very far. The other part, the part that had been waking up attentive in the pre-dawn, was quiet in a way that felt like recognition. "She would have been 3 years old," Kaya said. "This winter." "Yes," he said. He knew. He had counted. She looked at the cedar for a long moment. Something in the tight-wound mechanism of her chest, the one that had been releasing one small degree of tension every month for 3 years, or possibly for the past 6 days, or possibly since the moment a strange king had walked into her fever ward and asked for a list, released another degree, and another, quietly, without drama, without the spectacular collapse she had always half expected grief to require of her in the end. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the cedar's bark. It was cold. It was solid. It was there. "Her name," she said, "is Mira." The tense was deliberate. He heard it. He did not correct it. Soren came to stand beside her, not touching, not yet, and placed his own palm flat against the cedar bark beside hers. They stood there for a long time in the noon silence. 2 palms against old bark, the mountain air moving through the branches overhead, carrying nothing but the smell of cold pine and far-off winter, and the particular clean note of high altitude, which Kaya had always associated with distance, and which, for the first time in 3 years, she did not. He had intended to leave, he told her, on the 6th day. He told her this on the 7th morning, over the same shared cup arrangement that had become, without formal decision, a daily structure. He said it not as an announcement of departure, but as a fact he was amending in real time. He had intended to leave, and then he had not left, and now he was trying to understand what that meant for the shape of his remaining obligations in the Northeastern Review. She listened. She had learned to hear the structure of what he said, underneath the content of it, the way he organized information, the particular order in which he presented facts versus considerations, which gave her a reasonably accurate map of his reasoning process. He was a methodical thinker who occasionally arrived at non-methodical conclusions and was slightly unsure of what to do when that happened. "There are 3 more packs in the Northeastern Corridor," she said. "The Blackfen, the Iron Veil, and the Cold Step. You know this. They have been waiting for your review for 2 months. Yes, they need the review, particularly Blackfen. Their eastern border has been under pressure from the unmapped territory for the better part of a year, and they need the Crown's formal acknowledgement of their boundary claim on record before winter makes the crossing impossible." "I know. So you should go," she said. "Do your review. All 3 packs, in the right order, return to the Crown's seat for the winter sessions." She looked at her cup. "That is the logical structure." He was quiet for a moment. "And you?" "I will be here," she said, "doing what I do." "That is not what I asked." She looked at him. He had a particular quality of gaze at close range. Not fierce, not aggressive, nothing like the domineering Alpha King energy she would have expected from someone of his position. Patient, the way a person is patient when they are waiting for something important, rather than something convenient. "I have not been asked to be elsewhere," she said carefully. "I am asking now." She set her cup down. She took a long, measured breath, the kind she used in the healer house when she needed to think through a problem in order rather than reacting to its loudest element. She was an omega of a mid-rank pack. He was the Alpha King. The gap between those positions in pack law was not small, and the way that gap was managed, by whom, through what protocols, with what formal framework, would determine the character of everything that followed. She was practical. She understood this. "The formal protocol," she said. "For a king seeking an alliance with an omega of a territorial pack. Walk me through it." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, very briefly, before it was contained. "You want to talk about protocol?" "I want to understand what I am agreeing to before I agree to it." "That," he said, "is the most rational position I have heard from anyone in 11 years of governing." She waited. He told her. All of it, the formal petition to the Pack Alpha, the Omega's right of refusal at every stage, the bond confirmation protocols, what it meant for her standing in the pack structure, what it meant for his, what the court would expect, and how fast they would expect it. He told her, without glossing, and without the diplomatic softening she suspected he applied to most of his official communications, which was the thing she found most important. She listened. She asked 4 clarifying questions. He answered them in full. When he was done, she said, "The bond confirmation. That requires physical proximity, not a ceremony. It requires that both parties are willing. The proximity follows from that. And the mark." She was being precise on purpose. "That is the heroine's choice," he said. And the word heroine was wrong, she noted. Clinical slip, but she understood what he meant. "At every point, that is not mine to make." She absorbed this. She looked at the medicinal garden, which was past its best season, but still producing certain things, the way some things continued long past when they were expected to. "I will need to train a replacement healer," she said. "The pack cannot be left without coverage, and the junior position needs to be properly transitioned." She paused. "That will take at minimum 6 weeks." He inclined his head. "I will complete the Northeastern Review and return in 6 weeks. 7, she said. 6 is optimistic given what I am working with. 7 weeks, he said, without hesitation. She nodded once. Precise, unhurried, the way she moved through all significant decisions. And then she picked her cup back up and finished what was in it. because the practical continuation of the morning seemed like the right way to mark the practical continuation of her life, and she had always been better at beginnings that looked like continuations. 7 weeks and 2 days later, exactly as she had calculated, Soren returned. She was in the medicinal garden when she heard the horses. She was on her knees, pressing the mulch flat over the last bed she would put to winter rest before she left, and she heard the compound's ambient sound change in the familiar way, compressed, attended, and she did not get up immediately, because the bed needed to be properly covered before the frost reached it, and she had 3 more minutes of work in it regardless of what was happening in the main courtyard. She finished the bed. She pressed the mulch smooth with both palms, the way she pressed her palm to the cedar, the way she pressed her palm to her chest on the night she had first felt the pull. Then she sat back on her heels and took off her work gloves and gathered her tools and stood up and went to the entrance of the medicinal garden to see. The compound was busy with the organized chaos of a royal return, horses being managed, luggage being directed, the Alpha's household moving with the efficiently anxious quality of people trying to look like they had been expecting this and completely prepared. Rennick was in the courtyard, formal and composed. Several of his senior staff were with him. A small crowd of pack members had gathered at a respectful distance. Soren was dismounting. He was not looking at Rennick. He was looking at the gap in the medicinal garden hedge, where Kaya was standing, with her gloves in one hand and a trowel in the other, and garden mulch on both knees. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the 3rd day, direct, unhurried, with the full attention of someone who had decided what they were looking at was worth seeing properly. She met his gaze. She did not wave. She did not smile, particularly. She simply met his gaze with her own, level and steady, and after a moment, she turned back toward the healer house, because there were handover notes to finalize before the evening, and she had made a list. Behind her, she heard his footsteps separate from the crowd and follow. The formal petition to Alpha Rennick was made that afternoon, in the Alpha's study, with the correct documentation and the correct witnesses. Rennick received it with the expression of a man who had been expecting something unusual and was mildly relieved that it was at least being conducted through proper channels. He signed where he was required to sign. He asked Kaya, privately and with uncharacteristic gentleness, whether she was certain. Yes, she said. He accepted this. He was not a complicated man, Rennick, but he was an honest one, and the honest ones knew how to recognize a certainty when it was presented to them clearly. The senior healer, who had been conspicuously absent throughout the fever outbreak, was pointedly named as the permanent lead healer during the handover meeting. He received this with the look of a man realizing several things simultaneously. She did not speak to him about it. There was nothing to be said. The pack witnessed the transition through the medium of their own behavior, which was how pack transitions always registered first, not through announcements, but through the involuntary adjustment of proximity. A door held open by a senior warrior who had never held a door for her before, an acknowledgement in the common hall that had not been given before, the slight, instinctive recalibration of other wolves' deference, following the scent of the bond before the bond was ever spoken aloud. She noticed this. She had trained herself to notice things. On the night before she was to leave for the crown's seat with Soren's household, Kaya went to the eastern ridge one final time. The moon was not full. It was waning, 3 days past its peak, but it gave enough light for the path, and she had walked it enough times that she could have navigated it without any light at all. She went alone. She had not asked Soren to come, and he had not offered, which she understood to mean he had read the quality of the visit correctly. She knelt by the cedar in the familiar wet earth posture. Her bare hand went flat to the soil. The ground was colder than the last time, the true cold of late autumn settling in, and her hand went numb in the usual progression. She stayed for a long time. She did not have 37 moons of accumulated silence to fill. She had already said everything that mattered to this ground, on 37 different nights, and the ground had held it, and that was its function, and it had done it faithfully. What she said this time was brief. She said that she was not leaving the way she had imagined leaving Ashvale, not in the way she had sometimes, in darker moments, imagined simply being done, being finished, retiring from the effort of living at the only pace her grief would allow. She was leaving differently. She was leaving with something ahead of her that she could not fully map, which was unfamiliar territory for a person who had survived primarily through the discipline of knowing exactly what was in front of her. She said that she was afraid. She said it precisely, as a clinical fact, because she had learned that the feelings she named with precision were the ones she could manage, and the ones she left unnamed were the ones that managed her. She said she was going to try. She pressed her hand deeper into the cold soil. She breathed. 37 moons, she said quietly. Every one of them, not one missed. The wind moved the cedar branches. The waning moon laid its partial light over everything, specific and partial and present, which was, she thought, probably the best that light could do. She retrieved her hand. She held it against her chest, warming it. Then she stood and gathered herself in the way she gathered herself for every difficult thing, practical, deliberate, one step at a time, and walked down through the pines toward a life that was no longer the same shape as the one she had memorized. She did not look back. She had everything she had come with. She had the 37 moons. She had Mira's name, intact and held in the right place. She had her hands, and her training, and her grandmother's journals, packed with her other essential things. She had, threading through all of it, the specific warmth that had begun at the center of her chest 7 weeks ago, and had not diminished. She did not look back. The crowned seat was everything Ashvale was not, large, layered, loud, with the constant ambient pressure of too many wolves in too much proximity, corridors that smelled of multiple packs' distinct territorial chemistry, overlaid with candle tallow and ink, and the particular dry heat smell of buildings that had been heated for centuries. She disliked it initially, and said so. Soren showed no surprise at this. He showed her, instead, the parts of the crowned seat that were not loud, the northern courtyard garden, which was larger than she had expected, and which had, she noted with professional interest, been maintained with inconsistent botanical logic that she immediately began cataloguing for improvement. The library wing, which housed among its collections several volumes she had known only by citation in her grandmother's journals and had not expected to have access to in her lifetime. The small east-facing set of rooms that would be hers, separate from the formal royal quarters, while the bond was established and confirmed at the appropriate rate for a person who had been moving at her own pace for her entire adult life and was not about to stop now. The garden, she told him, on the third morning, is a disaster. Whoever has been managing the medicinal section has no working understanding of companion planting. I am aware, he said. The last healer was better at administration than cultivation. I am going to fix it. I was counting on that, he said. She looked at him. He had a quality she was continuing to map, a manner of saying things that anticipated her rather than managing her, that left room for her particularity rather than attempting to smooth it into a more convenient shape. She had encountered very few people who did this. She found it, every time she encountered it in him, unexpectedly disarming. She went back to cataloging the companion planting problems. He left her to it. She was beginning to understand, the texture of what they were building. Not a single dramatic architecture, but an accumulation of small, specific compatibilities. Her knowledge and his reach. Her precision and his patience. Her grief, which he had carried at a remove for 3 years, and now carried at close range, without making it smaller or trying to make it easier. his isolation, which was a different kind of isolation than hers, but rhymed with it in ways she was still mapping. She was mapping it the way she mapped everything, methodically, without rushing the conclusion, with the understanding that some things revealed their full shape slowly, and that patience, in the face of that slowness, was not passivity, but its own form of competence. She was good at that. She always had been. The bond confirmation happened quietly, on a night when neither of them had planned it particularly, when the moment arrived in the way that significant moments sometimes do, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quality of something that has been building its inevitability for long enough that its arrival is simply recognition. She said yes. He asked first, which she had known he would, and she said yes, in the same clear, direct voice she used for all important answers. The mark site ached, afterward, in a specific and private way that she did not share with anyone, but felt with absolute precision, like a compass needle settling into its true north after a long period of being spun. In the spring that followed, she planted the northern courtyard garden properly. In the autumn, Soren sat beside her at the crown seat's open window with a cup of tea in his hand and his shoulder warm against hers, and below them, the courtyard showed the first results of everything she had planted. The lavender properly companion-placed with the feverfew, the valerian in its correct bed, the cedar sapling she had transplanted from the Ashvale Ridge in the small protected corner where the north wall blocked the harshest wind. The sapling was small. It would take years to be a cedar. That was what cedars did. She held her cup in both hands. The evening light came through the window at the particular autumn angle that made everything warm and specific. Soren's shoulder was solid against hers. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed, the ordinary sound of a building that was, against all prior probability, becoming familiar. Mira's name was in the room, as it was always in the room, not spoken but present, the way some things are permanently present, which is not the same as loss, and is not the same as absence, and is its own thing, quiet and intact, and held in the right place. The sapling was small. It would take years. She was not in a hurry. She had learned patience the way she had learned everything else that mattered, not as a philosophy, but as a practice. One repeated action compounded over enough time that it stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like her own nature. The winter at the Crown's seat was long in the way that first winters in unfamiliar places are always long, not in duration, but in texture, in the particular effort of learning a new building's sounds, its cold spots, the exact hour the kitchen fires were banked, and the corridors went from merely cool to genuinely cold. She catalogued all of it. She kept notes, not because the information was critical, but because the act of recording was the act of belonging, and she was beginning to understand that belonging was something she was going to have to choose, repeatedly and on purpose, rather than something that would simply arrive and announce itself. She sat in on 3 of the winter council sessions, not as a formal participant. That protocol had its own timeline, and she had agreed with Soren that she would not be pushed through its stages faster than was practical, but as an observer, seated at the room's edge with her healer's habit of taking in a room's full dimensions before identifying where her function within it would fall. She watched the court's senior wolves interact with the information they were given, watched the quality of their listening and the quality of their questions, and began building a map of who in that room was thinking carefully and who was performing careful thought, which are very different things, and she had always been able to tell the difference. After the 3rd session, she told Soren that his packmaster of the Eastern Territories was receiving selective information from his border captains and either did not know it or was choosing not to address it. Soren looked at her for a moment. "That is a very specific observation," he said. He asked 2 questions in 2 sessions that would have been answered by the reports he should have been receiving. He asked them as if he did not know the answers, Either he has not read his reports, or his reports do not contain that information. Given the nature of the questions, the second is more likely. Soren was quiet for a beat. I had a similar concern. I had not moved on it because I lacked the specific framing. I can give you the specific framing, she said, if that is useful. That, he said, with the quality of quiet attention she had come to recognize as his version of warmth, is more than useful. This was not, she understood, the role she had expected to find herself in. She had come to the crown's seat as a healer, with a healer's function clearly defined and a healer's professional scope drawn at the boundary of the body's mechanics. She had not expected to find that 3 years of managing a fever outbreak alone, of running a borderline neglected healer house on operational problem-solving rather than adequate resources, had given her a diagnostic precision that applied to systems other than biological ones. She had not expected this to be something anyone here valued. She was recalibrating, again. She seemed to do a great deal of recalibrating. She had decided this was probably a sign of a life that was still moving, rather than one that had come to rest. The moment that most of the court would later remember, would recount, in the particular selective way that witnessing wolves recount the moments that confirm what they already suspected, was not a dramatic one. It was not a throne room declaration or a formal presentation. It was a corridor encounter in the East Wing, 6 weeks into winter, when she was returning from the library with 3 of her grandmother's journals tucked under her arm and a volume on alpine medicinal cultivation in her hand, and she walked directly into the path of the Crown's senior alpha, Lord Veth, who managed the court's formal hierarchy with the enthusiasm of a man who found hierarchy genuinely satisfying. Veth had been, since her arrival, professionally polite. The politeness had the texture of a door that was not quite latched, technically closed, functionally uncertain. He was waiting to understand the precise weight of what she represented before deciding how fully to open the door. She had understood this from the first week. She had not hurried the question for him. On this particular morning in the East Wing corridor, Veth stopped. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the usual professional courtesy was assembled between them, in the usual way, and then he did something small. He stepped aside and back, a half-step, the kind of involuntary physical recalibration that happens below the level of conscious decision, before the social mind catches up and could correct it if it chose to. He did not correct it. She passed. She inclined her head, as she always did, and continued down the corridor. That half-step was the door opening. She did not make anything of it aloud. She tucked the observation into the part of her mind where she kept the things that were significant in ways that exceeded their surface appearance, and she went to the library annex and opened the volume on alpine cultivation and got to work. Word moved through the court the way information always moves through a pack, not through announcement, but through scent and adjustment, through the ripple of behavioral change that preceded any formal declaration. She noticed it in small things over the following weeks, the way a path through the common corridor cleared slightly when she walked it, the way her contributions in the informal discussions that preceded formal council sessions were received with a quality of attention that had not been present in the first weeks, the way certain doors were held, certain acknowledgments given, in the involuntary grammar of wolves who were adjusting their understanding of what they were in the presence of. She did not need the adjustments. She was not waiting for them in order to feel certain of her own ground. But she noted them with the same precision she noted everything, and she understood them as the pack's biological acknowledgement of what the bond had already established, the matter being settled at the level of chemistry before it was ever settled in paperwork. Soren told her, on the evening of the first thaw, that the court wanted a formal acknowledgement, the official ceremony of bond recognition, the public naming, the formal record, the thing that would give the hierarchy its paperwork to match the chemistry. She had been expecting this conversation. She had her list ready. "I want to name her," she said. "At the formal recognition. I want Mira's name to be part of the formal record." He did not hesitate. "Yes. In the bond acknowledgement documentation. Not as a footnote, not as a marginal notation. In the document itself. I will have it drafted that way." She looked at him. She was looking for the presence of negotiation in his response, the slight adjustment of phrasing that would indicate he had agreed in principle but was managing the concession towards something smaller. She did not find it. He had said yes and meant yes, which was the kind of person he was, and she was still, at regular intervals, slightly startled by this. "Then yes," she said, "the formal recognition, whenever the protocol requires it." The ceremony was not what she expected. She had expected something that felt like being assessed, being presented, being held up to a formal light for the court's inspection, and found either sufficient or otherwise. She had armored herself, quietly and efficiently, for that quality of experience. What happened instead was shorter than she had anticipated, quieter, more domestic in its atmosphere. The court assembled in the formal hall, yes, with the candles and the formal placements, and Veth reading the bond documentation in his careful administrative voice. But the document was the thing she had asked for, Mira's name written into it cleanly, not as footnote but as record, as fact, as permanent accounting of the 3 years that had preceded everything that followed. And when Veth read that section of the document, the hall was very quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when the thing it is hearing is larger than the occasion that prompted it. She stood straight through all of it. Her hands were at her sides, completely steady. Soren stood beside her, in the same quality of deliberate stillness that had characterized his presence from the first morning he had walked into the fever ward. Not performing composure, simply composed, the genuine article, the thing that comes from knowing your own ground rather than from managing the appearance of knowing it. When Veth finished reading, the hall did not erupt into sound the way formal occasions sometimes do. Instead, there was a moment, she counted it, clinically, she could not help it, a moment of about 3 seconds in which something moved through the assembled wolves, like a change in atmospheric pressure, involuntary and total and unambiguous, a shared intake that was not quite breath and not quite stillness, but something in between. Then someone, toward the back of the hall, inclined their head, and then another, and then the adjustment moved through the room, like the ripples she had seen in smaller spaces, the pack witnessing itself, the hierarchy recalibrating, the biology preceding the politics as it always did. She had known this moment would come. She had known its general shape from the protocol documentation Soren had walked her through on the 7th morning at Ashvale. She had not known it would feel, when it arrived, less like a transformation and more like the world finally reflecting a fact that had already been true for some time. She was the same person she had been in the fever ward, the same person who had knelt on frost-stiffened ground at the eastern ridge for 37 moons, the same person who had trained her replacement healer with meticulous care and packed her grandmother's journals and walked down through the pines without looking back. Nothing essential had changed. The world had simply learned to see it. In the spring, she finished the northern courtyard garden, and it was good. In the summer, she began teaching a twice-weekly session on alpine medicinal botany in the library annex, attended initially by 3 of the Crown Healer staff, and eventually by 7, including 2 who came from the eastern packs and brought their own regional knowledge, which she catalogued with the same precise appetite she brought to everything that could be learned and recorded and made useful. The cedar sapling in the northern courtyard's protected corner grew through the summer at the steady, non-negotiable rate of cedars, which is slow and entirely certain. Soren brought her tea most mornings and sat with her in the east-facing room while the light came in at its particular angle, and they talked about the things that needed to be talked about, the border situation in the east, which she had helped him see more clearly, the healer training program she was quietly expanding, the accumulated daily texture of a life that was large now and still legible, still hers, which was the thing she had not been willing to lose and had not lost. She kept going to the ridge. Not every moon. She had built a new relationship with that ritual, given it a different shape now that she was not making the walk from necessity alone. Sometimes on the full moon, as always, sometimes on ordinary nights when the impulse arrived and was worth following, sometimes not alone. She never stopped saying the name. She never intended to. The cedar sapling stood in its corner of the northern courtyard, small and certain, and growing at its own pace, which was the only pace it knew, and the only pace it needed.